Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to do a non-spoiler review for the first season of the show Blue Eye Samurai. So this is a new animated show on Netflix, and I hadn't really seen too much leading up to it. I actually saw the author V.E. Schwab mention this and say that it had no right to be as good as it was. And I had only seen a few vague things aside from that, but I was really intrigued and I decided to go ahead and give it a shot. And I'm so glad I did because I really enjoyed this one. I loved the animation style. I loved the way the story unfolded. I loved the unpredictability of the plot. I loved the exploration of the themes. It is very brutal, very bloody, very adult, and I just want to give that heads up in case you are somebody who prefers to have the violence sort of hinted at but not really shown. It's very much shown, and it's part of, I would say, the way in which the story is told. It plays a pretty intense part of this particular character's exploration, and so I think the show doesn't shy away from it, but I did want to at least give you that heads up in case that's not really your cup of tea. But regardless, I wanted to give a little bit of information about the plot and then also highlight some of the strengths of the show and then some other additional things that maybe would make it either something you'd be interested in or not as interested in. So I'll go ahead and start with the general setup. We are looking at a time period in Japan when it has been closed off to everyone, and as a result, there shouldn't really be any mixed race individuals. However, our main character Misu is somebody who is half Japanese, half white, and she is very notably half white as she has blue eyes, and some of her facial features do not necessarily look like everyone else's. She is seen as this demonic, horrible person. She is seen as less than, and she has endured a lot of hardship from the time that she was a very small child. And also, just as a result of being mixed race, it also makes it so that anybody she associates with is then also facing a lot of hardship as well. So she feels very alone in the world. It is hinted at early, I don't want to say too much, but it's hinted at that people that she cared about, or at the very least maybe were caretakers of her, have been harmed. And so Misu is out for revenge. And that's kind of at the core of this, what this is about. It is a samurai action revenge story. And I think what's tricky about a lot of revenge stories is they tap into a lot of the same themes. Is it really worth it? Does the person become more of a monster in their pursuit of revenge than the person that they are pursuing? But I do think that this story, while it leaned into those themes, it did them very well. And it also had a lot of other aspects to it that made it worth, I think, watching, and made it a story that I constantly thought I knew where it was going to go, and then I didn't, which I really, really enjoyed. Misu's character exploration is fantastic. We do utilize a lot of flashbacks in this story, and I can be pretty picky about how flashbacks are utilized. I think if you watched my Castlevania Nocturne review, you know that. But in this instance, I think that you kind of have this idea that you have a grasp on what you're going to get, not just from the flashbacks, but you can see the connections already between the flashbacks and present day. But as the story progresses and as you get more episodes in, certain flashbacks really shift how you see things, and they really add so much depth to Misu, and you are devastated for her, for everything that she's had to endure. I kept thinking like, oh, I bet this thing happens, I bet this thing happens, because we have seen so many tropes done over and over again. We have seen certain plot lines kind of done to death, and so I kept thinking I knew what had transpired in Misu's past, and then I was very happy to be proven wrong time and time again. And there's one particular episode that I think, for anybody that's watched the show, you know which flashback that you go into that you're like, oh my gosh, because not only with the revenge plot line, one of the things that you see a lot of is, here's the bad things that have happened. It's turned them into this hardened, callous person so that they can go on this quest for revenge. But something that this show did was, it's like, no, the person has to learn to trust and love again and have even that taken for them to finally be in a position where they have nothing left. And it's devastating, but the reason that Misu is so set on revenge that you see throughout the story, but also something that I can reveal that's not a spoiler, is that the individuals who have caused this hardship for her are one of 4 white men that were in Japan at the time of her birth. One of these 4 men has to be her father. And it's not just that they have inflicted this horrible, difficult life onto her, but also they take part in illegal drug trade, human trafficking, and bringing in weapons into Japan that are causing a lot of harm. So you're seeing also this sort of turn of the century type of feel in the story where you have a certain way of life that is honored in Japan, but then you are starting to see guns brought into the picture and how that's starting to shift things. So there's some greater plot lines and some side characters that get introduced that I think are very interesting to follow. And the repercussions of the effects, not just on Mizu's life, but on all of Japan, is something that you start to see. You find yourself really rooting for Mizu, even though she is very harsh and she really doesn't seem like she has a whole lot of humanity in her. But obviously, when you explore everything that's happened, you see the depth of this character. That's one of the biggest things I want to highlight is it was a revenge story done well, not just because of the effects on Mizu's life and also, in addition, the effects on the entire country, but also because of Mizu herself and really seeing how what she's gone through has affected her and how awful everything is, the horrors that she's had to endure. It's one of those things where to see a person beaten down and mistreated and broken time and time again, where at some point you're like, yeah, get them. Where you're like, even if you become a monster yourself, like that's their fault. And it's something that I feel like is hard to create that emotion in a person, to really stir that anger up. But man, watching it, I was like, yeah, let's go. So one of the things about the story that I was saying plays a big role is the action scenes and the brutality of them. So it could have very easily fallen into almost like Monster of the Week. Not that they're literal monsters, but just that feeling of like, oh, every episode we're going to have this fight and this fight, then this fight. It could have very, very easily felt like we were always leading to the action scene. But I do think the time until action scenes had a lot of intrigue and really well developed plots going on. But it did mean that the action scenes themselves, you felt very emotional watching them because you knew how much was at stake. You knew how important Mizu's quest for revenge was. And so it had a lot more to it. What can be difficult about action scenes is if it's just thrown in there. And this is true of all stories across mediums, whether it's books, movies, TV shows. Action without any emotional connection, in my opinion, never hits as hard. But the emotional beats would all come together within the action scenes, and different action scenes had a different tone and had different colors utilized and different kinds of music used, and it always brought out what felt like the arc of that episode, but also the arc that we were in thus far in the story, where we were at the greater arc overall. So the whole time I'm like, all right, that fight was awesome, but you're like waiting, you're like, oh, wait until she gets to that castle and she gets that guy, and you just are so pumped and so ready. One negative, I will say, which I don't know if it was too much of a negative for me, but I really want to highlight this because it is going to be a negative for other people. The wounds are incredibly unrealistic in this. So Mizu endures so much, and then basically within 3 days, she's up and fighting again, and you're like, no, you're not. And the amount of things that she's like stabbed through a lot of times, and she's got stuff stabbed through her feet, and she's still walking around, running around, kicked, and all these things, and you're like, all right, you would be wiped out. You know, most of us, we stub our toes, and we're like, that's it for like at least a few minutes. And Mizu is basically taking death hits and just like brushing them off because willpower. So if that really greatly irritates you, it's gonna probably still irritate you here. The reason it didn't really bug me too much is because at some point I feel like the animators and the people that were writing this story were like, go all out on this fight. Just go for it. Have fun with it. And I didn't mind. I'm normally pretty picky about that too, where I'm like, weren't they just stabbed? But in this one, at some point you're just like, Mizu's basically not a person. She's just like a force. And yeah, stuff is going to bring her down a little bit, but she's fine. Just keep going. Look, this next part's really cool. So I didn't mind too much. it's still, I think, a little bit of a con. They could have been a little more realistic. They start out kind of realistic. There's early injuries that happen where Mizu has to recover, but then later, hardly. But still, the action scenes, not only is it a culmination of all the story beats, but it also, they're just fantastically done. The very first one, I think the initial opening of the show is very cliche. It's kind of like, oh, look, our mysterious protagonist is going up against this seedy bad guy who just seems like a bully, and now this other person wants to be their apprentice, basically, and you're like, all right, I've seen this before, but it pretty quickly shies away from the cliche and then builds into something else. But it definitely gave me a false sense of confidence, what I was talking about before, where I kept thinking I knew what was going to happen, and then it had the rug pulled out from under me. I almost feel like by having this cliche start, it enhanced that false sense of confidence. But regardless, I do think that the beginning section of this attempted to have Mizu need to recover, and then they just went away. They tossed that aside for the cool factor. And the animation itself is kind of a hybrid between 2D and 3D. It is somewhat similar a little bit to Arcane. It is not on the same level, though. So I want to make that very clear that while there's some similarities in the style, the colors also, I think colors are utilized really well in both of those shows. Arcane is just masterful, and it's next level, and there's like nothing like it, basically. So this one's not quite that level, but it is a step above a lot of other animated shows that I've seen. So I do want to give credit where credit is due. The sound effects, the movement, the music, I feel like the way everything was combined was really well done, and the way things would unfold, it made it so that the pacing, I never felt like I was bored. I was just waiting for this next thing to happen. I thought the pacing was phenomenal. The unpredictability element of the story contributed to the pacing feeling really solid. And even when Mizu's story starts to, if it slows down, somebody else, one of the other side characters, builds up. And then you're starting to see pieces come into play where what you weren't expecting to come into contact with Mizu comes into contact in a way you weren't anticipating, which I really liked. I just think that this was really fantastic. It's not maybe the most meaningful because it really does like to have its cool moments, but I still really enjoyed it. I thought the themes were done really, really well. I really hope it gets renewed for a second season because looking into it, they're kind of begging people to watch the show and watch it all the way through because I guess people that start the show, the numbers that Netflix pulls from when they're looking to potentially renew something has to do with how quickly people watch the entirety of a show. So they're trying to get people to watch the show all the way through, let it play within the first, I think, 28 days of starting it. So I hope that we get a second season because the way that the first season ends, it definitely needs that next season. There's so much more clearly to the story that I could see it's building to something much bigger. And it already goes from being this kind of contained revenge story to being something that affects entire cities. And I have a feeling it's going to affect a lot more than that if it is given those additional seasons. So fingers crossed that it does. I wanted to really emphasize again, though, if you are not into the action, the brutality, the really adult content that you can get, because there's some adult content in this, it might be a little too gruesome or a little too edgy for you. If you would prefer something a little more slower going, introspective, reflective, and realistic, then this is probably not for you. But if you are looking for something that is kind of a cut above your typical revenge action adventure and you're looking for something that has that additional depth and great character exploration, then I think there's a good chance that you might like this one. But anyway, that's it for a non-spoiler review for Blue Eye Samurai. I would like to do a video, it's a style of video I do for other things, especially video games, where I do an if you like this, try that. I'd like to do one for this as well, so that maybe some of the other recommendations I give can give you that additional like, oh, maybe it wouldn't be for me, or oh yeah, okay, well I like those other things, so there's a good chance I would like that show. So be on the lookout. That should be up sometime in the next couple weeks. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts on this show if you've seen it. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.